So I started to introduce Hi Fitzgerald this morning. He is University Distinguished Professor of Psychology at Michigan State University. What I want to say that is new and relevant to his talk, I think, is that he has been associated with a Michigan longitudinal study of family risk for alcoholism for over the life course for 23 years. He is a member of the American Indian Alaska Native Head Start Research Center, the Native Children's Research Exchange, and the Tribal Research Center for American Indian, Alaska Native Early Childhood Education. He's also on the advisory boards of the University of Nebraska Buffett Early Childhood Institute and the Oklahoma State University Center for Integrative Research on Childhood Adversity. I'll stop here.
Thanks for stopping, Paul. I've been married for 57 years, and my wife once threw about 4 dishes at me, but I was the perpetrator, so I'm not sure attachment had a damn thing to do with it. I think it's called love. Anyhow, I'm going to very quickly provide a run-through of many things that you've already heard. But just to sort of set the stage for what we're all here about, and that is the early origins of violence in males, and what evidence is there for that. So I'm going to do that quickly. Then I'm going to do some review of some relevant findings, but it was actually 30 years of the Michigan longitudinal study around issues related to the heterogeneity of life course pathways. And it's important for this particular study because every family recruited in that study was recruited on the basis of father characteristics, and the families were required to have a 3 to 5-year-old son. Nothing about mothers was relevant to the recruitment of families. And then I'm going to comment on the need for prevention models that begin at least at birth. I will comment more extensively on something we haven't heard a whole lot about here, and that's called fathers and their role in early childhood development in families. Finally, I will also spend a little time on a topic that we definitely have not heard about here, but which is one that I, in particular, have been pushing through what we've been observing in children in the longitudinal study of children and families at risk for alcoholism and coactive psychopathology. And that has to do with their minds, not their brains. Okay? So, is this going to go? There we go. So you've seen this particular slide, and you don't have to see it too much longer because it simply shows the extraordinary difference between male perpetrated violence and female perpetrated violence. That's the wrong way. Get the same data when you're in Australia, where I also do some research. So those bar charts look pretty different to me. And then I'm going to talk a little bit later about the risk-resilience continuum and show you a model of how I think much of what we've been talking about fits almost every life pattern of everybody in this room. So I'll talk about that a little later. But most of what people have presented here has to do with positing a set of developmental systems theory principles. And these principles really relate to the fact that things change. In my little opening comments this morning, I was really trying to show that things change. And that over the life course, in my case, a great mother and all that stuff, and a great first 8 years, and then stuff changed. And so proximal events play a critical role. And that's what all these things have to to deal with. You have access to, several of us have been to Oslo, Norway. That's where we get those pictures. So greater incidence for boys in both morbidity and mortality clearly points out that we are the vulnerable species, members of the species. A survey that was just published in most recent issue of Psychological Bulletin, I think, is just dramatic. Here are 1,605 studies that these investigators looked at in just 2 journals over quite a period of time, 7 years. And look at the differences in psychopathology. The left-hand side, the differences are so marked that they just say males more than females. And look at what they are. Antisocial personality, conduct disorder, they're dysregulatory kinds of behaviors. Okay? And then there's a whole bunch others on the right-hand side that are still male more than females, but more at 2-to-1 ratios, 3-to-1 ratios, things like that. So the evidence, it seems to me, is extraordinarily powerful around the point that males are much more vulnerable and much more at risk for biobehavioral dysregulatory kinds of functions, including high degrees of violence. Epigenetics. There are evidence for prenatal epigenetic changes across those things. You've heard a lot about nutrition. I'm going to mention that again. And postnatal epigenetic changes as well. Things change epigenetically in relation to lived experiences. They don't just sit there and have the piano player playing. There's a player at the piano playing it, and that's life. Okay, and that's important to keep in mind. It's the lived experiences of the organism interacting with its multiple environments that affect epigenetic change. Gene mutation rates 5 times higher on the X chromosome than the Y chromosome. 95% of the Y doesn't like the X, so it doesn't interact with it in DNA. So, genetic mutations are much more likely to express if paired with a Y, that's us, because no gene copy for it is on the Y. But there might be on an X. We look at maternal smoking. This study had 4,000 males in it, and smoking is associated with higher violence in males. Maternal smoking in a single parent, the recidivistic violence rates were 11.9 odds ratio greater. And if you added in a bunch of other predictors, that's the second little thing, single parent status, teenage pregnancy, unwanted pregnancies, that simply increases the recidivistic violence rate. Nutritional deficiency. Adrian mentioned this so many times, but he's right. Here's a study that looked at 26 countries and the degree to which these countries had low fish consumption rates, and there are higher homicide rates in males in those countries, 2.5 times more likely for antisocial personality disorder in adulthood, and boys were likely to be aggressive from puberty through the teens. Telomere shortening in response to stress, including the Bucharest studies. Telomere shortening in adults, dementia, osteoporosis, diabetes, stroke, cardiovascular disease, alcoholism, and stress. And in boys, prenatal to early childhood, responses to stress shorten telomeres. Telomeres are the thing that protect the chromosomes from damage. So they shorten, that's not good. Okay, so the Michigan Longitudinal study. In 1984, we began recruiting people for this study. We went to the courts and we recruited from court records men who were convicted of drunken driving with blood alcohol levels of 0.15 or greater. Or, if it was a second offense, a blood alcohol level of 0.12. They had to have a son, biological son, and had to be living and residing with the biological mother. So there's intact nuclear families. We wanted to recruit 60 of them from the courts, and then we went to the communities where they lived, which were the four counties surrounding Michigan State University. And so we walked door to door, starting 2 blocks away from the residence of our target family, and knocking on doors to find a family that had a biological son, and they were biological parents, to get a community control comparison. That effort, we found, after a whole bunch of knocks on the doors and lots of walking, we found 60 families who met that criteria, and there was no alcoholism, but another 60 families who met the criteria but also had alcoholism, but no record of drunken driving. Okay, so after recruitment, we then re-divided families into high-risk families, medium-risk families, low-risk families, high-risk families, alcoholic father, and very high antisocial behavior. Almost 2/3 of those with high antisocial behavior actually made a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. The medium-risk families, the father was alcoholic but did not have high antisocial behavior. In the low-risk families, there was no alcoholic father. And again, it didn't matter what the mother was. Okay? So our interest in this study primarily is father and son. Everybody in the family is in the study. So there are 2,600 individuals now over 30 years. So what did the boys look like at the preschool level? There they are, high levels of hyperactivity, mood disorders, difficult temperaments. You've heard all these things before. Problematic social relation, cognitive deficits, high levels of aggressive behavior. And interestingly enough, and hold this in mind because I'm going to bring it back up when we talk about the mind, precocious cognitive schemas about alcohol and drugs. These 4- and 5-year-old boys were better able than their community comparison groups, especially those in the high-risk family, to identify alcohol beverages by smell, to identify alcohol containers by perception, and had expectancies for subsequent use because, and those expectancies matched father's consumption at 4 and 5 years of age. At what do those 3 to 5-year-olds look like when they're 12 to 14? Weaker family structures, more negative self-evaluations, poor family orientations, a lot of family conflict, externalizing behavior problems, more antisocial behavior, more association with delinquent peers, and peers with juvenile justice contact, and less association with peers involved in conventional activities. Sandra Scar, many years ago, has sort of like the classic study that shows that when you enter adolescence, you pick the peer groups that fit your personal lifestyle. So if I'm a risk taker, I'm going to start hanging out with risk takers. If I'm a drinker, I'm going to start hanging out with drinkers. If I like conventional activities, I'll start hanging out with other peer groups that do conventional activities. And then what do they look like when they're 18 to 20? Self-regulatory dysfunctions, difficult temperaments, the same stuff in the high-risk group. So strong continuity in the life course pathways for boys in that highest risk group. Now, what does a high-risk alcoholic family with a father who has antisocial personality disorder sort of look like in everyday lived experience? I'm only going to give you one example so that you have an idea of the kind of families in the study. So every Thursday night we have a poker party, and my buddies come over, and we play poker all night. And can you win the game? Your prize is my wife. Okay? Every week. So that's one of those families. I'm 3 years old, but when I come into the study, but I was born into this family. And for 5 years, I live in psychopathology, and I am raised by people with high levels of psychopathology. About 44% of the wives in a high-risk sample, clinically depressed, extraordinary marital conflict, and I'm sure there's perpetration both ways all the time. So that's my lived experience in these families. Low variant MAOA, we've heard that before, associated in our study with behavior disorders, aggression, and violence in boys. But an interesting thing on behavioral disinhibition and negative affect, it's related to those things and MAOA, 5-HT, only post-puberty. It's not related pre-puberty. So what happens as we enter into that puberty period? We get big shots of testosterone, and we've grown up in this psychopathology, and all of a sudden that particular variant expresses itself. We use analyses called latent class analysis, and so here are a couple of things from, and more person-oriented analyses than other types. So from 7 to 16 years of age, here are here's a set of kids who we labeled the comorbid class. These are boys with high inattention and hyperactivity and high levels of aggression. And you can see that over that life course period from 7 to 16 years of age, lots of variability. So if we're thinking of the prevention in the lives of these kids, where in that life course pathway on these individual curves of development do we intervene in order to have some kind of effect? Very difficult thing. This is an etiological study, by the way. We do not intervene unless child abuse or suicide etiology is suggested. And then here's a healthy class. Inattention, hyperactivity, low, very little variability, aggression, very little ability, and how these things relate to alcoholism and drug use. Well, you can see that in the comorbid conditions, significantly different, significantly more alcohol consumption and drug use than in the healthy class. And then we had two other ones here. I didn't show you those. But if it's aggression alone, it also is more significant use of alcohol. This is Jenny Jester did that work, and she did another study. She likes to do really sophisticated quantitative modeling. So she looked at 4 different pathways: early onset severe, developmentally limited, young adult onset, and cumulative. These are pathways that my colleague Bob Zucker had posited in early 1980s. He posited there were 6 different pathways related to alcohol misuse. But look at this early onset. Men only. No women, no in our study, fell into this class. You can see them at the top, in the top set of curves, the early onset, and they're not there. And as you look at that, make sure you check that the scale on the top figure is different than the scale on the bottom figure. So those curves, in terms of symptoms, are higher in males than they are in females. But look at this. These are the characteristics of the boys in that early onset severe class. This is early onset of drinking. Family density of alcoholism, child history of severe abuse, childhood antisocial behavior, all much higher. Education at baseline and occupation at baseline is lower. Depression and Hamilton depression, Beck depression, higher. Suicidality, higher. Adult antisocial behavior, higher. And keep in mind, because I didn't mention it, so you can't have it in mind, this merged both of the longitudinal samples. We had boys at age 3, but we had parents as well. So the parents are followed. And so this is from age 15 to age 45. Okay? Age of first drink, younger. Age of first drink in our boys was age 8. And this is a serious drink. This is not a taste. Age of first symptom, much younger. Age of first diagnosis, younger. And when I get to mind, that age of first symptom is 5 years of age. Okay? And then the progression to the first symptom was much faster in these boys than in those other 3 classes. So, what are the social costs of high continuity trajectory? Academic difficulty and failure, date rape and sexual assault, other kinds of physical injury to self and others, particularly in terms of automobile accidents. If we eliminate drivers from 18 to 25 and didn't allow them to drink, your insurance rates would really be cheaper. Impaired social relationships, loss of social capital, higher poverty risk. So, we talked a lot about diversity, and I need water. And recently, some investigators at Child Trends reminded us that there is a continuum of adversity. The one that is in the literature mostly now is ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences, from the San Francisco study. But there, and they had a set of variables that they used as ACEs. Many other versions of ACEs that have come out since then. But this is the sort of old, well, he's a really good friend, so I can call him. It's an old Arnie Sam Roth notion that risks are additive. And if you have 4 or more of them, that's bad. And it didn't matter which 4 they were. Okay? From a more developmental science change sort of perspective, it might matter which 4 they are. So, and especially if you add in, then there's trauma. Trauma can be a single event that is so severe in its impact on the individual that it can have long-term effects. It doesn't have to be 4 of them, but if it's a traumatic experience that's repeated, like repeated sexual assault by a father to a daughter, for example, you don't need to have 4 versions of that. One, repeated over time, gets us sort of to the idea of toxic stress. Chronic exposure to ACEs or traumatic events without any kind of supportive caregiving or intervention along the way. So if you put all those things on a continuum, that you'll see as the risk to resilience continuum. So here's the model that drives all the work that I do. And for 16 years as provost, associate provost of Michigan State University, this is the model that drove all the work we did in areas of my responsibility at the university. So it's a model that's really adaptive because it posits that things that happen at one point in time, like infancy and early childhood, could have a lasting effect. But it could also be countermanded or changed by the next transitional period in development in this model called childhood. And what happens in childhood sort of keeps preparing you or not for what's going to happen in adolescence. And what happens in adolescence may or may not continue to enable you to make a successful transition to emergent adulthood and adulthood. And if you look on the right-hand side of the model, there's all the really nice things that we would say build resilience. I am not an advocate of resilience being something that is biologically inherited. That's my opinion. Resilience to me are all the positive things that happen in the life course that enable you to develop confidence, internal structures, and adaptability and all those things. And on the left-hand side of this are all the things that would countermand resilience. So we call them risks. On the arrow that goes up on the left-hand side is economic and racial inequities as a cross-cutting risk factor. And on the right side are all the things that would accumulate resilience. We spend our entire lifetime, every one of us, somewhere on that continuum. We might come into the world at high risk at birth. We, especially people with hair like mine, are going to go out of this world fighting to try to stay on the right-hand side of that risk to resilience continuum. And we do that in a wide variety of ways. But we move around on that continuum. Stuff happens. And the degree to which we have good support structures on the right-hand side enables us to handle stuff happening better than if we don't have any kind of support systems that keep us moving us towards risk. So that's called prevention and intervention science. What do we do to try to keep us on the right-hand side of that continuum? So we know all these things. We don't have to do another study ever. We just don't. We know all these risk factors on family characteristics. We know there are all kinds of individual characteristics. And we know that there are all kinds of characters in the social environments. And we know they're all nested together. That's again, the developmental science notion. It's Uri Bronfenbrenner's ecological models. It's all the systems theorists, most of which started in biology and physics. Everything is nested into each other, into everything else. And so one way to think about cause and effect is not the behaviorist, logical positivist view that A leads to B, but a whole bunch of stuff somehow or another configured together leads to some kind of outcome. So the whole universe is one great big correlation. And we have to find the component things that predict outcomes and which of those correlations and connections are more powerful predictors than others in combination. On the individual characteristics, in the Michigan longitudinal study, 3 to 5-year-olds externalizing behavior was the best predictor of their externalizing behavior at 6 to 9 years old. So as these characteristics develop in the individual, they become part of the driving force of that individual's interaction with the environment and carry predictive load. And I want to tell you, we have so much data. We have more data on these families than any other study in the world. Data collected every 3 years over 15 different domains. 80% of them are genotyped. We have longitudinal studies of fMRI scans, you name it. So, critical developmental transitions. We don't pay enough attention to developmental transitions in any field of developmental psychology and its applications in any field. Try to get kindergarten teachers in the public school system to collaborate with preschool teachers to provide a continuity of transition from preschool to kindergarten. Good luck. Try to get the elementary teachers to coordinate the curriculum and make smooth transitions to middle school. We have all these silos, and we don't think developmentally in the way we try to apply and make transitions. So, here's your ACEs. You probably all know what these are. And I always put this up to make a deeper point. There are 74.2 million children in the United States, at least. I'm sure we probably didn't count them all. But think of it. 11% of them have 3 or more ACEs. That's 8,162,000 children in this country with 3 or more ACEs, which are predictive of all kinds of negative outcomes. So, at least half of them are boys. And what we know about boys is that a substantial number of them are going to have dysregulatory functions, some of which are going to be violence. So this is not an exercise where we're talking about 100 people in this study, 2,600 in our study. We're talking about 8 million children. A great many of them who are going to grow up to be 8 million parents. So think of all those boys in our study and how we characterize them. They're going to be fathers. They're going to be fathers. We have to fix the boys. And so I'm 100% in opposition to my colleague Richard about where we invest resources. Here's the Australian Temperament Project on ACEs, same things. If you look at the WHO analyses worldwide on ACEs in multiple countries, they are strikingly similar. 18 to 22% across 1 or more, 8 to 12% with 3 or 4 or more. Doesn't matter the country, doesn't matter the political system, etc. Soviet Union, same percentages as we have. Soviet Union, Russia. So what are the implications for infant mental health theory, research, and practice? We have generally several types of approaches in universal is a public health approach. Everybody who's pregnant don't drink wine. Now, we don't know whether 1 glass of wine has any effect or not, or if it takes 4 glasses of wine. We don't know that. So, don't drink any. That's a public health issue. And it worked. Okay? Except for people in low socioeconomic classes. Educated women, stop drinking. Women who had other kinds of life course issues to deal with, that was not the top of their priority. Okay? So, we still have fetal alcohol syndrome babies. Interestingly enough, 7% of fetal alcohol syndrome babies are born to women who never had a drink. The idea is that the guy who was really drunk had epigenetic changes in sperm that was caused. It's about a 4-year-old study now, and the first study to point that out. If we look at infant early childhood effective home models, there are 2 that are comprehensive in their impact, and you heard one of them presented today. The other one is the Healthy Families America. All these are evidence-based practices. If you go into NIH, NICHD actually, or the Administration of Children and Families, and say, where are the evidence-based practices for home visiting in the United States? You'll get this list. Only 2 of those are comprehensive across the 4 areas in showing outcomes, and David's is one of them. There's a move now in prevention science, driven by a special issue of the journal Prevention Science recently, to move to more person-oriented precision interventions. And very much related to this, I think when David Oles was describing what nurses do when they go into homes, fits this characterization. It's to find out what the heck is going on in that home. Not the home next door, but that home, with that mother and her circumstances, and to the extent possible, his circumstances too. And then begin that intervention based on that family's characteristics, not some other family's characteristics. One of the technique is called adaptive sequential intervention designs. These are about 4 or 5 years old, again described in prevention science. This is, I'll use David's approach as a model. So things start to work. Things are going right. And so you start scaffolding up. You don't stay with the same intervention the whole way through the process, but you start to scaffold up. And things get better and better. So your prevention program flows upward based on how it's working with the individuals involved. So it's changed over time based on the individual's responses to the treatment. Another approach is to actually use sort of community-based participatory research approaches. So instead of saying, these are the services you're going to get, you say, what services do you need and what do you want? So that person getting a treatment or intervention actually becomes part of defining that intervention and buys into it more. Because now they're empowered to be part of the process of trying to fix themselves. And then there's the use of personalized devices, and I'll give you a couple examples of that in a minute as I turn to fathers. Using all the kinds of devices we have now to give immediate feedback to people. A colleague that I used to work with, but I stopped doing something. So she does it on her own now. She has a neurodevelopmental sort of approach to infant mental health interventions. So mothers in 5 cities, 4 in the United States, 1 in Canada, Edmonton, wear these devices. The devices are monitoring their heart rates and their skin conductance and their activity. Connie gets this information through a computer system thing, and all of a sudden, the mom seems really stressed. So she gets a call on a wrist phone. How you doing? What's going on? And so there's an immediate intervention based on the physiological feedback that suggests stress that enables a person to contact her and to begin to talk her down, work her way through. This is Connie Lillis. She has everything into a big, massive, multi-framed neurobiological brain model, but it's really a behavior modification approach to try to change things based on stress. So, the guys that we forgot to talk about very much, dads. We have 70.1 million fathers in the United States. We have 24.7 million of them in married couple families currently, or at least last year. 2.7 million single father households. That's a 9-fold increase since 1960. And there's a 4-fold increase in single parent mother households. So 2.7 million. Most of them are younger, like single parent mothers. Minority, less educated, and poor. We have 214,000 stay-at-home dads while mom's working. And 18% of all of our preschoolers in the United States are now cared for by father during mom's working hours. Fathers are around and they're active and they're very much involved with caring for kids. Colleagues of mine headed up by Natasha Cabrera. In 2007, we put out a little model about how can we think about doing father research and organize it in some kind of way that would give coherence to it. We revised that model in 2014 because There's so much research now coming out of fathers that we had to hustle and change our model. So this is the current model we have. Somebody mentioned father absence earlier today. These are the things that are correlated with father absence. And the number of studies are overwhelming. And they go back for a long time. This used to be the only thing we ever studied about fathers. They weren't around. That's no longer the case. All kinds of deficits in cognitive development, all kinds of negative impacts in social, emotional, and moral development. But look at that right-hand side. That's the key. In terms of developmental psychopathology, children raised in father-absent homes, deviant peer group selections, higher rates of physical and sexual abuse, higher rates of aggression, bullying, and antisocial behavior, involvement in the criminal justice systems, alcohol and other drugs, sexual intercourse earlier, smoking, and AUD. The course of early onset is smoking, alcohol, sex in children of alcoholics. Higher probability of possessing weapons. And that early onset is 8 to 12, smoking, and sex by 13 or 14. Now, what if dad's around? Quite the opposite. Quite the opposite. Language and cognitive development. Kids ask more questions. Who, why, all the 5 why, what, where, and especially why at certain age groups. Higher school attendance, less problems, more likely to enjoy school, better problem-solving skills, developmental psychopathology, less depression, less stress and frustration, less antisocial behavior, less bullying, fewer behavior problems, especially externalizing, less involved with the criminal justice system. And why, maybe, are they in better control? It's because somebody the name of Daniel Paquette at University of Montreal was smart enough to say, you know, I don't think this attachment thing really fits men. And by the way, there are studies of attachment with males. Babies do form attachments with males. And after we had about 3 studies to show that, we decided that was enough, but we needed 10,000 studies of mother-infant attachment in order to figure that out. So they came up with an activation risky situation to mirror Ainsworth's strange situation. It's the same 6-part sequence, but in this, it's father and son, and the father and the stranger and all that. The father's job is to provide encouragement of risk-taking in his toddler. These are not infants, these are toddlers. And the risk-taking is across the various levels of activity in kids. After father-stranger interaction, all that, the father encourages the kid to climb up some stairs. So the kid who doesn't want to do it, now the father's encouraging him to take a risk and do it. For the kid that dashes right for the stairs, the father's job is to stop that behavior. Okay? So there's risk-taking and a control. Here's the sort of layout. This is, Paquette started his work about 10 years ago, but there's lots of it going on now, so it's going to be interesting. He does attachment situation and risky situation with the same kids. So he can see how they respond to the Ainsworth attachment, and he then sees. So he gets the same thing everybody else gets. About 24% of boys have so-called disorganized attachment, but they have good activation scores with the dad. They stop when he says stop, and they can get nudged to take a risk as he nudges them along. So they suggest that attachment, the parental role, is sensitivity of children in times of stress. Parental behavior is to keep the kid in close proximity, particularly when it's stressed. A safe base, kind of secure base kind of concept. And the primary parent that does that and engages in that activity is the mother. On activation theory, it's the parental role is to encourage risk-taking and exploration. The behavior is discipline, limit setting, and self-control. And the primary parent, from Paquette's point of view, who does that is the father. So, Richard Fletcher, Interventions for Fathers. Richard Fletcher in Australia has the SMS4 dads. This is a technology system for connecting fathers who might have first-time fathers who might have questions about what's going on with babies and things like that. They can call this number and they get a chance to chat. It's being replicated across most of the states of Australia, and including a special version for Aboriginal fathers, and with a great deal of success. And they're about to make it nationwide. Kyle Pruitt and Marcia Pruitt, they're supporting father involvement. Lots of success described in that program too. It focuses a lot on talking about differences between families, recognizing parents as experts about their kids. So often we go into families as if they are totally stupid idiots. And there's no better way to really make sure you don't get authentic interactions with people is to make them feel like they're stupid idiots. Okay? So I want to go in and work with the American Indians, and you don't use community-based participatory research practices completely, you're never going to get an authentic answer from them. You'll get social desirability stuff just to get rid of you. And then there's a third little model based on the Oregon model by DeGarmo. So all these people are writing chapters for me in a book that will be out next year on a handbook of father and child development, prenatal to preschool. 36 chapters, so it's going to cover a whole lot of research going on about fathers and their kids during the birth to preschool age period. So, the mind. There are a variety of ways that people talk about the mind. In infancy and early childhood, we tend to have now pretty much collapsed that all into the notion of intersubjectivity. It has to do with how we derive meaning and how does meaning making occur. So children derive meaning about themselves through parent-child interactions, determining constructive paradigms of self-other and self-other relationships. And relationship dynamics also generate intersubjectivity or the construction of the phenomenological or the existential self. And I'll tell you what I mean by that in a minute. And at least one person in this room was part of this quote. Repeated exposure to expressions of hostility, anger, and distress in the neighborhood may facilitate the development of negatively oriented knowledge structures, which likely become consolidated as internal mental representations of distrust and suspicions of others' intentions. Now, there are two, Michael Lewis and Jeannie Brooks Gunn, many years ago, described two aspects of the development of self. One was the categorical self, and the other was existential self. Categorical self is, I'm a boy, I'm short, I'm tall, I'm black, I'm not. All those things, the categories that you can see and put yourself into. This existential self is, who am I? Much of the existential self is formed by interactions with mom early on, or dad if it's in present. You're such a happy little boy, to a 2-year-old who knows nothing about happiness. You're so sweet. You love this. For a 4-year-old, a 3-year-old just coming home from the zoo, tell dad or mom, what would he see at the zoo? Remember those monkeys? How did the monkeys go? Boy, we really liked that, didn't we? We help construct the meaning of the world in our verbal and interactions with our young children. We tell them how they feel. We also say, you're a rotten little bastard, you're just like your father in an alcoholic family. So now I'm a rotten little bastard, but categorically I'm dad, because I look like him physically. So the meaning making that takes place during the first 5 years of development from our children in the high-risk family led me to give talks when I was in Australia and now here of how 5-year-olds can be alcoholics. Even though they never touched a drop, they have cognitive, perceptual, and sensory experiences and structures related to alcohol use that other age kids don't have. They have expectancies to use alcohol just like dad at 5 years of age. And those things are related to, I would suspect, because we don't have the genotyping, I know, the genotyping and fMRIs until age 14. That's when we started doing all that. But I suspect that the neurobiological embodiment of those existential ideas of who I am are already there. And Amaniti and Gillespie is a person that did work on mirror neurons, in their book on the origins of intersubjectivity in infancy, make that case. So this is the model that I've been pushing in the alcoholism literature related to the development of who am I, my mental representation, my meaning making about me in relation to other people, because I see how dad and mom treat each other. I see how dad or mom treats me, and that becomes part of my sense of the relatedness experiences of people. Okay? So, any questions? That's it. It's got to be somebody who thinks I'm all wet. Come on. I will make a comment on the question that was asked of Ken. I didn't quite understand the question about attachments, because I think that's using the concept of attachment in a different way than certainly than what Bowlby came up with, which really had to do with mother-infant, what the old social learner theorists call dependency. It really has to do with when mom leaves and there's a separation that's distressful. When my wife leaves, I'm not distressed. I'm distressed when she threw those plates at me when we were about married 2 years, but I deserve to have them thrown at me, so that's okay. But so love and emotional friendships and things like that are not quite the same as an attachment, at least in the original Bowlby way. So just wanted to make that comment.
If there are no questions.
No, somebody's headed to a mic.
I had a question. You know, we've had a lot of discussion about different levels of intervention and targeting, and it seemed like, I wasn't sure from what you said whether you posited universal interventions and then...
Yeah, the public health model is to have signs everywhere, don't drink and drive, don't drink and have babies and all those things. That's the public health model.
And it sounded like you were you rejecting that model?
No, I'm not rejecting it. I'm saying that only produces small effects, most of those models. And most of our prevention models produce small effects comprehensive models like David's produce bigger effects because they're much more targeted to the dynamics of the family that's involved in that intervention.
So, you know, the public health perspective comes from Jeffrey Rose, which I think is what you're talking about. And I think he would argue that you need both universal, you try to move the whole population with small effects.
Sure.
And then you also have targeted interventions. And I think the danger that we've gotten into in this meeting is just talking about we're going to target this group or this group without recognizing the need to do both.
No, I
things.
agree with you 100%. We need both, but we need to move more towards the person-oriented interventions because it takes into account the dynamics of their individual lived experience a little bit more. That's all. Yeah.
Thank you, Hi, for answering the question, where's Papa? Now, in thinking about these intersubjectivity situations in the intact family with the male and the female, one of the things that I found to be a deep problem is that there is a competitiveness between the mother and the father, each one having difficulty with the other one's style. And in the maternal-centered universe we live in, it seems that what I call male parenting, I don't talk about fathers, I talk about male parenting and the qualities that go with male parenting. But it seems that the male parenting has fallen out of style in this competitiveness that we're experiencing between the genders and that I say exists in the intact family. Could you comment on that?
Yeah. As I think I pointed out, there's the attachment guy. 70 million fathers in this country, 24 in families, 24 million in families. So, yeah, if you only focus on low-income families where there's a lot of single parenting and other stuff going on, you should not generalize fathers in other economic levels, educational levels, other kinds of things, as having the kinds of lived experiences that they have to deal with at that level. So I don't agree with you that there aren't a lot of really good, effective fathers around, because the data shows us, in that one slide I'll show you, that there's a whole heck of a lot of positive outcomes for children in those families where fathers are involved in parenting. So we don't have a good handle on what we will, because, as I said, the amount of research going on with fathers is incredible. 20 years ago at the World Association for Mental Health, we may have had 5 posters on parenting or something. In Rome, this past, when we were there, a few months ago, whatever, last year, 40% of the whole program were papers on fathers. So we're going to know a heck of a lot more around that area, especially in the 0 to 5 domain. But as our little model that I showed you, we had to update in just 8 years. We had to do that because of every developmental journal that I get, at least now, has at least 4 or 5 articles in it on fathers at all age levels now. So they've come back, and we'll see the positive results of that as the next 10 years go by. Go ahead.
Yeah, most of that was just questions because I have no clue what the hell I'm talking about. So, but the reason I read a book a long time ago and it sent me down this rabbit trail, mostly about community, not necessarily about attachment. But all the conversations I've had here for 3 days, my mind went that way, so I asked. But the book I read was called Tribe by Sebastian Junger.
I don't know that book.
He's a war correspondence guy, so he goes out with these teams and reports. And So he did a bunch of research and took his own experience and realized that there were people that were dying to get back to situations where extreme violence was happening, where life-threatening violence, but they were dying to get back to this situation. So 2 examples. He said military guys that he had worked with and studies he's seen, when they're there and they're in the midst of the chaos, they're good until they get to a base where they're separated from their team or back to the States, which is, in my mind, of like circle of security or attachment base.
Yeah.
You got this kid who has anxiety, they get back to the parent, they're good to go. But we have this guy who left parents, goes to anxiety, comes back to parents, but they're not the savior of his anxiety. It's, again, this is just something I made up. It's the parents in the new
Yeah,
place.
I understand your point. So if I was in Iraq or Afghanistan or somewhere for 3 or 4 years or on multiple duties, and the same guys were there that I'm fighting with, you're damn right I would have connections to them, and probably pretty deep emotional attachments to them. But it's not attachment in the same sense. And if one of them died, I'd probably be very sad and upset. We have, with Adrian Blow in our Department of Human Development and Family Studies, there are 19,000 families in Michigan who have had one of their parents, or sometimes 2, with 1 or more tours in the Middle East. Our question that we happen to be funded for, or he's funded for, and I'm just part of, has to do with what is the impact of having a father or a mother, or both of them, missing for a year, and you're 1 year old, because that happens.
Yeah.
Now, that's a real attachment thing. So we're looking at the impact there. At the same time, we have the same high rate of suicides of males who have had those tours of duty. And I'll bet you that's related to the issue that you're raising.
Well, and that's interesting you say that, because I was having a conversation, I'm going to make fun of somebody over there, with a philosophy student one day, and we were talking about the difference between suicidal rates in African American communities who have experienced a lot of oppression and the transgender community who experiences oppression. And the fact that transgender community, they more often than not, they have far more suicidal ideation and completion. And so the only thing I could come to is that maybe in the African American community, they still have attachment figures or communities, or there's not, like in their own community, they're not rejected for being black, they're accepted for being black. As to in a transgender community, they lose attachment figures, they're gone. And so then, that led me, down the line, military guys, and then on to domestic violence, where I thought, possibly.
Yeah, I think another good natural experiment, if you want to call it natural, that relates to the same sort of issue. So in our great wisdom to make Indians not Indians, we took 100,000 of them, children, over a 60-year period away from their parents, stuck them in boarding schools. Then after 60 years or so, we thought, well, that's probably not a good thing to do. And so we changed it. And we put them in white foster homes. And they did worse. So we destroyed their culture, we destroyed their rootedness, and who did it affect most? Boys. High suicide, high alcoholism and drug use, high rates of not being responsible fathers with respect to being in the home. So we effectively created psychopathology, alienation, lack of responsibility by our efforts to eliminate American Indian culture and make them all white. So I think that's another good example of, so now there's a great movement that I'm involved with, as Paul said, to restructure and root American Indians into their culture, including bringing back language. So, because language is culture. Language is a sense of who I am. We took away the whole spiritual world. We took away their whole sense of what their knowledge is all about, what their culture is all about. And I said, wrap up.
May I ask you a question? Oh, did they? All right, I'll stop.
I have to wrap up. Sorry.
So,